So you're taking the measurement quiz, and one or two questions might ask about different properties, units, and devices. And so this video is basically a list of devices coupled up with their units and the properties that they measure. So one property is distance or length, how far. So the unit that we use most often for distance is the meter, and lots of different devices we can use to measure distance. Like you can use something flexible, like a tape measure. That's one thing you can use. Or you could use good old-fashioned meter stick. That's something that you could use. This device right here, this is made for measuring very precise small distances usually. This device, whoops, that's my cat. This device is called a micrometer. Figured I better write this one down since maybe you haven't seen one of those before. Another device that measures distance. In your car, there's something called an odometer. And this tells you how many miles your car has driven. A lot of them are electronic these days, but you've seen this kind of thing before on the display of your car. This one's going to sound weird to a lot of you. It's called a spectrometer. And you look through this device and it tells you what wavelength of light you're looking at. So like right here, around 650 nanometers, you'd see red. At around 550 nanometers, that's a billionth of a meter, that's green, and so on. So light is what color it is because of what length its waves are. That's kind of weird, but that's the way it is. So those were a bunch of ways to measure distances. And now let's do some speeds, some speed devices. Well, speed measuring devices, they measure distance per time. So usually we use meters per second. You don't have to use meters per second, but that's typical. So you're familiar with a speedometer. I don't need to show you one of those. But maybe you're not familiar with the way that we measure wind speed. This device tells you how fast the wind is blowing. Or they've got modern ones now that look, they're handheld, you know, you get a little digital display. This device is called an anemometer. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a speedometer for the wind. Okay, so next, let's talk about pressure. Pressure, the unit for pressure, let me give you just a quick definition. Pressure is force divided by area. Maybe I should come back to this one. You know what? I think I'm going to. We'll see if I forget. Let's jump down to heat. So heat, the unit of heat. Heat is a type of energy, and we measure that in a unit called the joule. So how can you see how much heat something has in it? How many joules worth of energy it contains? Well, if it's something that you can burn, you burn it. So all you do is you make this a can, and you suspend some water above something that'll burn, like maybe a peanut or a piece of wood or something. You burn it, and you see how much warmer it makes the water, and that'll tell you how many joules worth of energy were in the object. So this device is called a calorimeter. And it's called a calorimeter after the calorie, and that's an old unit that we used to use to measure energy. And the food industry, unfortunately, is still using that unit, even though it's kind of silly. So let's go to loudness. The unit we use for loudness typically is the decibel, but watts per square meter is also nice. But how can you measure loudness? Well, you can get an app on your phone that'll do it. And also, there are devices made specifically for telling how loud something is. This is just called a decibel meter. Not a very creative name. Decibel meter. So that's how you can measure loudness. Force. We measure force in a unit called the Newton. Yes, it is named after Sir Isaac Newton. He was a really smart fella. So how do you measure force? It's pretty easy, actually. All you need is a spring will do it. A simple spring can measure force. If you apply a force to the spring, it stretches out. You measure that stretch, and you can tell how much force was applied to the spring. So what would you call this? You could call it a force meter. You could call it a scale, I guess. That would be fine. Okay. So that's force. Let's see here. Um, what about frequency? We've already talked in this class about duration, or just time. And we figured that was just measured in seconds usually. But frequency is a little bit different. Frequency is per time. So slash seconds. What do I mean by that? Like, let's say your heartbeat is 2 per second. We actually have a unit for this for per second. We would say 2 heartbeats per second. That's 2 hertz. Okay, so 2 hertz is the same thing as 2 per second. How could you measure frequency? Well, you could use a stopwatch. That's one way to do it. But there are also meters out there that detect how many times something happens per second. Like right here, this is a frequency meter and it's showing 230.4 hertz. You can get an old school device that shows frequency like this, and this one is probably showing electricity because electricity is usually 60 hertz. Okay, so let's move on to magnetism. So magnetism, the unit for magnetism, there's a couple that you might see, probably not in this class because we won't discuss it very much, but one is called the Tesla, and another one is called the Gauss. These are two different ways of measuring magnetism. Now, do you need a really fancy device to detect magnetism? You could have one, but you could use something as simple as this. This is just a compass, and a compass lines itself up with the magnetic field of the Earth, so you could call it a magnetometer. So a compass is really a simple, magnetometer, a magnetometer. Before I move on, the device that you would use to measure frequency that I didn't write down the name of it for you, that would be, quite simply, it's called a frequency meter. Okay, so resistance, let's go there. Starting to talk about some electricity stuff here. So resistance is how much electricity gets slowed down, and that's measured in a unit called the ohm. Named after a famous dead guy. And how would you measure ohms? You would use some sort of a meter. There are meters made specifically to measure ohms. This one goes from 0 to, looks like 500 ohms. And you'd use this like on the wiring of your house or something. But there are also devices like this one. This thing is made to measure lots of different electrical stuff. Like if you have it set right here, it's measuring volts. If you have it set here, it's measuring resistance. If you have it set here, it's measuring current. We'll talk about all that in a minute. So the device for measuring resistance, if it's just ohms, it's an ohm meter. And if you have a device that will do all kinds of stuff, we call that a multimeter. Okay, moving right along. pH. What is pH? pH is a rating of how acidic or basic something is. So I'm just going to write acid or base. And a pH, a unit of pH, it's just for us, it's just a number on a scale. And how would you measure that number? Well, you would use a device you can get like at a garden supply store, and it looks like this. This girl's using one right here. It's just a little device you stick in some liquid, and it tells you whether it's an acid or base, and it gives you a number. So you probably guessed it. This is called a pH meter. Okay, so moving along here, I made some space up above. This one you guys will already know. If you're going to measure angle, it's going to be in degrees. If you take physics, we'll work with another unit called the radian, but in this class we don't need to worry so much about that. What do we use to measure angles? Well, one way to do it is with a protractor. I'm not going to write that down. You guys know what these things are. So that's the tool that we use, or the device that we use to measure angles. Radiation. Radiation can be measured in different units. There's becquerels, but we're just going to say a count. So if you get hit by one small amount of radiation, we'll call that 1 count. And how do you measure that? Well, if you're working with some really dangerous stuff, maybe you would use this device. This device is called a Geiger counter, and it counts every time it gets hit by certain types of radiation. It just keeps track. It makes these little popping noises. Or maybe if you work in a hospital lab where they have radioactive stuff, you might wear this little badge device. And this badge device serves a very similar purpose, and it's called a dosimeter. And dosimeter, and it just counts how much radiation you've been exposed to. Potential difference, that's a fancy word for voltage, and we measure potential difference with the volt, and so that's one of those things that you can measure with a multimeter, or if you have something specifically made to measure volts, you would call it a voltmeter. So it's measured with a voltmeter. Only 2 left to go here. Power is measured in watts, and a device that will measure watts, here's one. I've got one of these in the house. I bought this to see how much power different devices were using in the house. So what you do, it's called, funny name, it's called a kilowatt. But anyway, you plug your your TV or your whatever into the device, and you plug your device into the wall, and it tells you how many watts, how much power your device is using, and then that way you can see how much money you're spending on it. This device would just be called I guess you'd call it just a power meter. And then lastly, this one is kind of simple, a really easy one. If you want to know direction, like let's say the direction of the wind, you'd probably use degrees, you'd think. But if you're watching the weather, they say things like, well, the wind's coming out of the north or maybe the northwest. How do they find that direction? Well, they have a very simple device called a wind vane. Okay? And that, even though it's old school, it still works. There are modern ones, that you see on weather stations if you look around, and these have cell phones that call the station up and say, hey, this is which way the wind is blowing. So to measure wind direction, we use a wind vane. Okay, so I'm over 12 minutes. That's lots of devices, lots of properties, lots of units. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more ammunition for the measurement quiz.